Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled to be with you today again for the virtual reading group. We're continuing to read Hannah Arendt's book, Between Past and Future, one of my absolute favorites of her books. We're reading it more slowly than we've read it in the past in order to give ourselves a chance to really dig into these essays, which she calls exercises in thinking. They are an attempt to build muscle, build the muscle of thinking. Thinking meaning to stand in this gap between past and future, the place where tradition has been broken, where we are left rudderless and without a kind of religious or authoritarian or national tradition. And we have to figure out, as she says at the end of the last essay we wrote, what is authority? Figure out how to live together. The elemental problem of the living together with other people, absent those guidelines, those banisters, as she sometimes called them, of tradition. And so these are her attempts to say to us, here's how you think. Here's how you go about this crazy, difficult thing called thinking, which too many of us don't really know how to do. And the essay we're reading today is called What is Freedom? It's an attempt to ask an important question, I think. What is freedom? But why? Why is this a hard question? Um, uh, it's a hard question, she thinks, because for a couple reasons. One is that she thinks that most of the people who've thought about this question have gotten it wrong. Now, that's, of course, a bold thing to say, but she thinks that the entire philosophical history of the question of freedom is basically mistaken. And it's mistaken insofar as that it has seen freedom as a property of thought and the mind, rather than as a property of politics and the action and of living together with others. And she thinks that there's been just a complete misunderstanding of freedom in the tradition. Now, the fact that a bunch of philosophers get it wrong shouldn't be that surprising. And one of the one of the way she drives this essay forward is she says most of us know better than the philosophers, and we still somehow accept this truism, right? That freedom is the main goal of politics, the raison d'être of politics, as she puts it. But it's been, on the one hand, reduced to a truism, and on the other hand, we somehow still think it's true, even though almost our entire philosophical tradition and even many of our political traditions go against it completely. And so she is going to try and unpack and unearth what she thinks we all know, but has been hidden by the mistakes of our philosophical tradition and the way we think about questions like freedom. The second reason she thinks it's hard to answer the question, what is freedom, is that thought, which we all do, and science, which we're all influenced by, both tell us that we are not free, right? She says that on the one hand, we believe that we are free. We assume that we act as we choose and that we are therefore responsible for what we do. We assume that people in general, when they commit a crime, do so freely, or when they, show up early, do so freely, or show up late, do so freely. And in fact, much of our political and moral life, she says, is based on this assumption that we are free in the sense that we can have free will. At the same time, she says, we also have come to believe that we are not free, right? We believe that whether we show up or not is based on innumerable causes, uh, some of which we might know and some of which we will never know, that make that determine how we got up that day, whether we set our alarm, whether we didn't set our alarm, whether we are someone who wakes up easily or not, whether we get enough sleep. Um, and so we all have sort of internalized this scientific worldview that a butterfly flapping its wings here, influences what somebody does halfway around the world. Um, and this scientific assumption is based on the fact that there are all sorts of physical, biological, mental causes that go into our action that suggest that we're not free and that we are really people who have, given into causality. And that this leads to a contradiction, she thinks, in between the assumption that we make about freedom in practice, that we are all morally and politically free, and in theory, would suggest that we are all, acting according to biological, physical, chemical, mental causations. And this is the departure point of her essay. And she's like, as a result, the question of freedom has been fundamentally confused. We sort of hold both these thoughts in our heads and we don't actually figure them out. And she says, well, okay, one person sort of thought about it well. His name was Immanuel Kant. And he helps clarify this to some degree because in his practical philosophy, his thinking about action, he distinguishes between theoretical freedom and practical freedom. And what he says is that even though we can't prove that we are free in a practical sense because of whole sorts of things, we never see freedom, we never see ourselves acting freely. It's nevertheless the case that when we act as if we are free. We act on the assumption that we are free. And so Kant says, therefore, even though we can never prove that I am free, I am practically free in the world. Okay, she says that's a nice proof, but it doesn't really solve the basic problem, right? The basic problem is that the danger, she says, that persists is that as soon as we start thinking, we make freedom disappear, right? Because we think that our thoughts tell us what we should do, and therefore what we should do is not a matter of our free choice, it's a matter of simply conforming to our thoughts. Thought in our fundamental insights, she says, is opposed to freedom. And she says this is one of the reasons why philosophers have not paid much attention to freedom, because they care more about reason and thought than they do about freedom. And freedom has disappeared from our history of political thought. And this essay is very much an attempt to bring it back, and to bring it back in a way that she thinks matters, as a matter of politics and action. It's an exercise in political thinking. We want to, in thinking about freedom, think about why freedom matters to us today. And so she's going to go back and forth in this essay. On the one hand, articulating her idea of freedom as it's built and discovered in acting together with others, and on the other hand, contrasting it with the philosophical history of freedom that she thinks covers up that first idea. Freedom, she thinks, only comes to be taken seriously by thinkers and philosophers after St. Paul in the Christian tradition, and Augustine after him. So if we want to understand how the alternative modern tradition of freedom gets understood, we need to understand a little bit about St. Paul and Augustine. St. Paul discovered in himself an inner struggle, right? On the one hand, he wanted to obey his body and sin and pursue carnal pleasures. On the other hand, he knew the law, God's law, which told him to follow the law of God and reason and to suppress his carnal pleasures. And so what Paul's problem was that he needed to not follow his will to sin, but follow his will to follow the law of God. And he needed to do so voluntarily, because otherwise it wouldn't be a free submission to God. And this leads Paul to the discovery of the will, which is that even if I don't, even if I don't do something like my sinful pleasures, I have to will that I don't do it. And similarly, if I do it, I can still will that I do it, and my will is thus good and free. And so what Paul says is we actually have to move our area of concern from what we do in the world to what we do in ourselves, from doing to an inward kind of believing. And Augustine follows up on Paul in this way and says that the law tells me to will what God wills. But I also will what God doesn't will. And what matters, says Augustine, is that in this choice between willing and not willing what God wills and not willing what God wills, that in this battle in myself, what matters is that I overcome my bad will with my good will, and I turn towards God. Again, it matters not what I do in the world, it matters what I do inside of myself. And this is this religious struggle, this struggle for religious conversion, as she puts it, in the first few pages of this essay, is the beginning for her of the modern idea of freedom as free will, as locating the question of freedom in my ability to overcome my bad wills and will in accordance with the good or the law or with God. And it's a turn inside myself into my thoughts. It's against this tradition that Arendt wants to recuperate, which he thinks is an earlier tradition, a Greek and Roman tradition, in which freedom needs to be understood not in my will, but in my activity and actions with others. So according to the Greeks, she thought freedom was based in action, not in the will. She thinks that freedom is exercised when one acts in the world in the midst of other people. And so what freedom demands, right, is a public sphere or a space where you can be seen to act. And thus, she says, freedom resembles a kind of theatrical performance. It's a matter of acting and having people see you. You need a public space with spectators in order to act and to be free. And so the definition of freedom, she says, is to act in public with others in a way that people see you and your acts matter. And so freedom, she says, is simply to act in the sense of acting in public. And so she'll write on page 144 to 145, she says, the field where freedom has always been known as a fact of everyday life is the political realm. Freedom is actually the reason that men live together in political organizations at all. Without it, political life as such would be meaningless. The raison d'etre, the reason for being of freedom, of politics, I'm sorry, the reason for being of politics is freedom, and its field of experience is action. Now, this is an extraordinary claim, and I think many of us sort of just hop over it. But to say that the reason for the existence of politics is freedom, right, also says that the reason for the existence of politics is not other things, right? And she mentions those other things. She says it's not justice, and it's not equality, and it's not power, right? Freedom is not about those things. Freedom is about, politics is not about those things. It's about freedom. This is an extraordinarily unique understanding of politics, in which what she wants to say is that the reason that human beings come together and live together and form politics together, form polities together, is not to achieve justice, is not to achieve equality. It's not to amass power. It's to have the experience of freedom. Freedom understood as acting together with others. She says that we're not free insofar as we live simply in a private life, in tribes or in a household where we're ruled by necessity. Similarly, she says we're not free under despotism, because under a despotism, we have to retreat from the public world and live in privacy. She says that in order to be free, we need three things. We need to become aware that we act together with others in public, which means we need to be liberated from necessities. We need not to be constantly worried about food or housing or shelter, because we need to be able to act in the world with others. And we need a public space where our acts will be noticed. A town hall meeting, an agora, a place where people come together to act. And thus on 147, she says that without a politically guaranteed public realm, freedom lacks the worldly space to make its appearance. You can't have freedom without a politics. Politics is about and exists in order that freedom be. It's something to take seriously. That's the reason we come together to have to be in a political world, and not to do justice. And it reminds us that for her, she says this in a number of places. Actually, it's actually a common theme in her work, although I think it's not noticed very well. She says that you can live a very good human life without justice. She doesn't think you can give a good human life without freedom. And part of it is, she knows, look, she's lived through incredible injustices. She knows that the world is not just, the world is not fair. You should strive for justice, right? But achieving justice is never going to happen. She doesn't think that justice is a humanly achievable end. She does think that freedom is something we can experience, and as a result, that's what politics is for her. The one problem that she then confronts on page 148 is that we can no longer take freedom and politics for granted since the rise of totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is defined in many ways in her work, but one way, and I think the way that's most central to her understanding of totalitarianism, is totalitarianism is the expansion of politics in such a way that it results in the complete evisceration of freedom. A totalizing politics is one in which a propagandistic, ideological, political system, seeks to do away with all spontaneity and all resistance, and have people live in simply the way that the totalizing government insists upon, not only in public but also in private. And so we having experienced totalitarianism in the 20th century, for some of us still in living memory, and certainly for many of us in memory of lived loved ones and others who suffered through it. We are aware of the danger that politics can pose to freedom, right? The opposite, right? She thinks politics is about enabling freedom, but totalitarian politics eviscerates freedom. And so it turns us away from a politics that is grounded in freedom, and we come to see freedom as the escape from politics. She says on page 148, freedom begins in this new world where politics ends, because we have seen that freedom has disappeared when so-called political considerations overruled everything else. And so this is the danger that totalitarian politics, not only does it eviscerate freedom, it makes us think that politics is about the absence of that the freedom is about the absence of politics, whereas as she understands it, freedom is about engaging in and acting politically. And this sort of reaction to totalitarianism, in which we think that freedom begins where politics ends, is very seductive to us, because it actually accords very much with liberal political theory. Liberal political theory identifies, seeks to have freedom, but it sees freedom as something that can only be guaranteed through security of the state, and that the freedom that the state guarantees through security, the Hobbesian state or the Lockean state or the Rousseauian state, is the freedom to act in private, to have families, to have businesses, to grow and to expand our private power and private desires. And Mill tells us we can do that so long as we don't harm others. And so the liberal idea of politics is one in which we're free from politics, that politics provides a secure staging area for us to live our lives free from politics. And so this is the danger that she sees in our time, is that the true idea of politics for her, the meaningful idea of politics as about enabling freedom, has been in a sense endangered by three things. One is the history of political thought. Two is the turn away from politics through totalitarianism. And three is the rise of liberal political theory and a liberal politics, which seeks to actually turn us away from politics. And so this leads her to say, wow, it's pretty shocking that, we would not think that freedom and politics go together. And yet she ends part one of this essay by saying that despite the enormous weight of this liberal tradition, and despite the urgency of our experience of totalitarian politics, this is on page 149, and despite the fact that both of these things, that the weight of the liberal tradition and the philosophical tradition and our recoil from totalitarian politics, point us in the direction of divorcing freedom from politics, in spite of all that, she says, I think the reader still can hear in the truism a truth, namely that freedom is the raison d'etre of politics. And she says that the rest of the essay is an attempt to reflect on that truism, to reflect on this truism that freedom is the reason for the being of politics. She begins part two of the essay, saying that freedom has been made internal, right? And she wants to say that freedom, as it relates to politics, as she understands it, is not a phenomena of the will. Instead, she wants to say that freedom is the power to call something to be, right? And she uses Shakespeare to make both of these claims, right? So she cites Shakespeare for the idea that freedom is simply free choice, and therefore, since I cannot prove a lover to entertain these fair, well-spoken days, I am determined to prove a villain and hate the idle pleasures of these days. So I can't do one, I do the other. It's a choice. But she also says that Shakespeare understands freedom as the power to call something into being. And she cites Brutus, where Brutus says that this shall be or we will fall for it. That is the freedom to call something into being as she understands it. In order to understand this distinction between freedom as a choice, an internal choice, and freedom as a power, she does a little bit of history on how freedom gets understood as will. And I told you a little bit about this before, starting with Paul and Augustine. But the basic point that she wants to make here is that the philosophical tradition comes to see action as involving the intellect on the one hand and the will on the other. The intellect is what tells us what we should aim for. It makes right or wrong judgments. And then the will is simply the faculty in which we command ourselves to execute that judgment. She wants to unearth another idea of the way we act, not as action as the intellect, the will, and the will enforcing the intellect, right? She wants to say that action, this is on action, insofar as it is free, she wants to say, is under the guidance neither of the intellect nor the will, right? It needs both, yes, but it springs from something other than that. And the thing that it springs from, action, is what she is going to call, following Montesquieu, a principle. Now, what a principle is one of the more difficult things in some of her work. But I think it's probably easiest if we try and understand what a principle is through some examples. So Montesquieu says that the principles that motivate aristocracy and a monarchy and our honor, and aristocracy glory, and democracy equality. Okay, well, what is love of equality as a principle? In a way that leads us to act freely. Insofar as we go and engage in public debate, and we talk to other people, and we engage in the effort to govern ourselves as a republican form of government. She says we do so not because of some intellectual thing that commands our will to do it, but because we are motivated by a principle of the love of equality. We believe that every one of us has a right to think and govern ourselves. And so she says that in politics, right, freedom appears in the world when we act in the world according to such principles. The appearance of freedom, she writes, like the manifestation of principles, coincides with the performing act. It's not like freedom doesn't come from some idea that is then actualized by the will. When we go into the world and we act freely and we treat people respectfully and equally, and we show that we love equality, we actualize that principle. We manifest it in the world, and we do so, and that is what she calls freedom. And so she says, men are free, are being italicized, men are free, right? As long as they act, neither before nor after. For to be free and to act are the same. To be free and to act are the same. You can't have freedom unless you're acting in the world. And you act in the world, she says, to make manifest these principles, whether it's the love of equality or the love of glory or the love of honor. And thus, she says that there's a way in which our freedom is understood as a kind of virtuosity. The people who are most free are not the greatest thinkers who understand some concept of freedom or the concept of justice or the concept of good. They are the people who are virtuous in being free, in engaging in the act of treating people equally. And so she takes from Machiavelli this idea of virtuosity, virtu, right? It's the excellence with which man answers the opportunities the world opens up before him in the guise of fortuna, right? Things happen, accidents, opportunities happen. The virtuous person is the one who acts in the world according to principles that are not his own principles, right? Not what I want, but are publicly meaningful, like love of equality, honor, or glory. And in acting in that way, we perform. We need an audience. We need a public space where freedom can perform. And this is what she means as this idea that what politics does is it allows us to be virtuous. But virtuosity is not something that just helps us. What virtuosity does is manifest the principle that we believe in, principle of equality or of honor or of glory in the world. And so she says, if we understand the political in the sense of the polis as this public space that makes virtuosity possible, then the end of politics, and the end of the political, the goal of politics, or the raison d'etre would be to establish and keep in existence a space where freedom as virtuosity can appear. And it's not freedom as virtuosity then doesn't just bring into the world freedom and virtuosity. It also brings into the world the principles, the non-subjective, not universal, but non-subjective public principles that we believe we should live according to. And that's why politics has to have as its end freedom, because not only does it make us be free, which is, she thinks, one of the core understandings of what it means to be human, but in being free, we make the principles that make our life meaningful apparent in the world, and we strengthen them. And that's the other. So, I mean, the two greatest attributes of being human for our end are to be free and to be meaningful, to matter. And what freedom does in politics is it makes the principles that give our world meaning and allow us to matter apparent in the world. She ends the chapter with a reflection on courage. She says that despite all theories and isms, somehow we still believe that to say freedom is the raison d'etre of politics is no more than a truism, right? Somehow we still think that actually, no, politics is about justice and politics is about ideas and not about freedom. And yet she says, somehow it's more, it is true. And we still, that belief that we have we have to hold on to, and we have to explore it more and think about it. And that's what she's going to do in these essays. And in order to do that, we have to understand courage, because courage is what allows us to act in the public sphere. Courage is what is demanded by the public. It tears us out of our private concerns, our bourgeois liberal concerns, right, with our family or with our monetary or jobs, and makes us act in the world. And so, because courage pushes us to act politically in the world, because courage pushes us to act freely, it pushes us to acknowledge and help manifest those principles, those public principles, which matter more than ourselves, the principles of the world which matter more than ourselves. And it forces us, therefore, to risk our lives in the name of the world. And this last line of this text, of this section of the text, of section 2, is one of my favorite lines in all of her work. Some of you know the Arendt Center sponsors a Courage to Be lecture series and a Courage to Be Common Course at Bard. It comes from this line, right, where she says at the end of part 2, courage liberates men from their worry about life for the freedom of the world. Courage liberates men from their worry about life, from their concerns of life, of living, of income, of job, of family, for the freedom of the world. Courage, she continues, is indispensable because in politics, not life, but the world is at stake. We don't engage in politics to keep ourselves alive, right? This is, a controversial point of hers, to go back to her distinction between the social and the political. Politics is not about the social. Or the private. It's not about doing well or keeping ourselves alive. We engage in politics because the world is at stake. Because what we need in order to live a meaningful political life are publicly accessible, publicly accepted, agreed upon principles. We need to believe that the world is something we share, and that that it's worth preserving and acting for. The great danger of nihilistic thinking, from Nietzsche to the present, right? All those people who think that politics is simply about power and amassing power, and that anything is acceptable in politics as long as you win. The great danger in that is that it destroys institutions and principles that will elevate the world above life, and it makes everything simply about personal interests rather than building a common world. And that's a danger that I think all of us around the world today are experiencing. Certainly in this country, in the United States, we're about to have an election in which I think that very issue is what's on the ballot. Is politics simply about the ability to say and do anything as long as it means you can win? Or is there are there some higher principles engaged in politics that are that even if they are inconvenient, we're going to hold on to? And this incredible nihilism that has taken over not only the politics in this country, but I think around the world to a large extent, is very much what Arendt is talking about in this essay. So these are the first 2 sections of the What is Freedom essay. And we will read the next 2 sections next week, but for now, let's just try and understand and talk about and make sense of these very rich discussions that she has. You can engage, obviously, as always, engage the conversation in the chat. Please be respectful. You can also raise your hand and we'll have a conversation amongst ourselves. Thanks very much. I look forward to the discussion. Jerry, good to see you.
Bravo!
And please,
Roger.
yes. Hey,
You
Jerry.
can hear me?
Yes.
Uh, well, we're right in the heart of Arendt's thought,
Yes.
and you made that clear. I mean, no one, I think, has ever thought about freedom as she did. It is really the beating heart of her political thought. Uh, I want, it's, I get asked virtually every day, I'm asked, do we have a free will? Is our will free? And there's a great deal of opinion that says no. And Arendt was very aware of it. It's very well informed opinion sometimes, perhaps most famously, most well known by the exemplary English thinker Gilbert Ryle, who simply called it, "What is freedom? It is the ghost in the machine." And people, I believe, Arendt knew that. She knew it very well. And I think it's interesting a way that she countered it. She said, you want to have the experience of freedom of the will when you're waking up in the morning and it's a chilly morning and you really want to go back to sleep for a few minutes, or you need to get up for right away. And she said, I will to get up and I nil to get up. I will to stay in bed or I nil to stay in bed. It is always the willing, always the freedom of the will is experienced in the nil. It is not a very pleasant situation. And mind, once you go back to sleep, or once you get up, you are no longer experience the freedom of the will. That's done. That willing, nilling process took place before your experience of the freedom of the will was had before you made the decision one way or the other. Now, that seems a little vague, perhaps, but I was trying to bring it down more concretely. Roger, the name of this book is, you well know, is Between Past and Future. That is the present. And you have spoken very eloquently about how Arendt lays such great emphasis on the present. That also is, I think, virtually unique in her work, although it appears in the work of mystics. The present. What is between past and future? It is the present. Now, is it her present when she wrote these essays in 3/4 of a century ago? Or is it our present? Our present, the lived experience between past and future. And my specific question to you right now is, if those three things that we've talked about here in the book before coming to freedom, which is the center of the book, before coming to that, we talked about tradition, what has been handed down from the past. We've talked about authority, which has grown. Authority really means to grow, grown from the past, and religion, not as worship, but what has bound us to the past. And I wonder, and my question, Roger, is, you think that somehow in the experience of freedom, there is some need for our own experience of tradition, authority, and religion?
Thank you, Jerry. Wow. Uh, that's those are excellent questions, and I think I can say something to them, but they're huge, and I want to just acknowledge that grandeur of the question. Um, so yes, between past and future lies the present. Um, the present is marked, as you eloquently put it, by the break of tradition, the loss of authority, and the privatization or public loss of religion. Um, uh, all three go together, which leaves us without these banisters, without um, uh, a tradition or an authority to paper over our disagreements or or where we don't in a public world see the same, and leaves us with the problem of how do we live together. Um, that is the situation that Arendt saw in 1958 or around when she wrote these 54 to 58 when she wrote most of these lectures. And it's, I think, still the situation we're in today. Not because the world we're in today is the same world that Arendt was in, but because we're still confronted with the break of tradition, the the loss of authority, and the political absence of religion as a bond that ties us to a people. And so I think very much, I think one of the reasons that Arendt's thinking uh, travels well in time from her time to ours is that the fundamental uh, situation that she's analyzing is one we're still in. That I don't think that's changed. The really grandeur of your question, right? Is there a possibility in the experience of freedom uh to experience a new tradition? Can we freely um uh in a sense build a new tradition, inaugurate a new authority, um uh found a new religion? um these are, I think these are the kind of questions that her work uh um pushes us to reflect on. In her book on revolution, which we've read and have talked a bit about, and in the essay on what is authority, which we read last weekend, um, she talks about how the American Revolution was the one revolution in which the experience that the people had not only was an experience of freedom, of free, um, of not only of liberation from England, but of the free building of a new of new institutions and constituting a people. But it was one in which, somewhat through fate and luck, but also because they understood that you needed, if you wanted to create uh a free polity that would also last, you would need not just the experience of freedom, but also the experience of authority. And they tried through the Constitution and the Supreme Court to build institutions that would have not power, but authority. And she thought that for a certain period of time, at least, they succeeded. That suggests that, it is possible for free action that is thoughtfully engaged in, where people are aware of and aiming to build not only freedom, not only to act freely, but to build institutions that would have the kind of free obedience that comes with authority, is possible, but it's very difficult. And you know, she thinks that it happened in the United States and that it can be lost. And she says at the end of the Revolution, you know, that when the United States Constitution and the United States Supreme Court cease to be worshipped and cease to be seen as authorities, the freedom that was built in the United States will be lost. Because you know, freedom can't last without authority over time. You know, I think in this essay, which is not about authority, it's about freedom, she's talking about these things called principles, which again, I think are very important, but under theorized in much of her work. And I don't mean theorized in a political theory way. I don't want to theorize them, but under thought, you know, they're not, she doesn't talk about them that often. This is one of the key places that she does. But I think what's really essential about principles is that they're not personal, right? I don't act in public realm in order to make manifest my own ideas. I act in the public realm to make manifest what I consider to be fundamental principles that we share insofar as we are part of a common political world. And so in a Republican form of government, what we share is a love of equality. And we have to act publicly in such a way that we treat people with that kind of respect and equality. And in doing so, we make manifest the principle, and we make the principle alive for others to act on too, right? Others have to see it and experience it and then have the courage to act on it. And that's how I think she thinks that freedom can not only be an action where I express myself, but I express a publicly acknowledged principle. That publicly acknowledged principle is still not authority, but it's what can lead us to share a world in which we will be open, I think. I mean, like, I'm just trying to channel my understanding of Arendt. This is not where she writes it exactly like this. But if to the extent we create a world in which the principles are active and public, we become open to acknowledging authorities that we share as well. A constitution, a court, things of that sort. Once those principles disappear, or people don't have the courage to act on them, or people don't believe in them, or they're seen as simply, everything is seen as simply a mask for power, then not only do you lose authority, but I think you also lose freedom in her understanding as well. I hope that helps, Jerry. I don't, you know, I mean, these are very big questions you asked. I don't know if you thought that was helpful or not.
Thank you, Roger. It's worth talking about, but we talk about it.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Here we go. Hold on. Stephen.
Thanks, Roger. I have a little bit of a sense that Arendt is getting the cart before the horse. Although you've, in just answering Jerry, you've alleviated that a bit. My fundamental observation is kind of, I guess maybe the way I was introduced to political thinking was that the ancients, the guys of Plato and Aristotle, and those who came up to them all the way up to Hobbes seemed to me primarily concerned with order, which I think entails some idea of justice, and not so much freedom. And that with Hobbes, we flip to the liberal idea of freedom, which is primarily limits and preventions of constraints by government and others. In discussing religion, authority, tradition, I think she's kind of looking that way, but she's not very explicit about it. And you know, trying to think about freedom in our time today with the problems that I think you very accurately represented. I'm not sure we can get anywhere unless we address directly the issues of order, which can be the legal system, constitutionality, but those seem to me fundamental. And one other kind of fleeting thought is when she looks at Rome, she can say, well, there's tradition, there's religion, there's this authority. But in the Greek tradition, which she seems most grounded in to make this argument about freedom, I don't know where she's getting it from. I mean, maybe that is somewhere. She read Greek, I don't. So maybe she's finding sources that I couldn't begin to know. But among in
Okay.
political theory classes, I don't see that.
Yeah. So the ancient philosophers, for the most part, she would agree with you on that they are rebelling against freedom or opinion or plurality and trying to impose an order. We read about this quite explicitly in the last sessions on when we read the chapters on Plato and Aristotle and the what is authority chapters, right? Plato rebels against the death of Socrates and sees that people are not listening to good persuasion and truth, and tries to develop an idea of truth that will be able to impose itself on the world through a philosopher king. And so without a doubt, Plato thought in those terms. Similarly, Aristotle thinks that the people need to be taught through education how to how they should think and act. And this is the second attempt to establish authority, right? By a kind of educational superiority of those who know and see that will educate and teach the rest. So you're right that the tradition, and our end fundamentally agrees with you on this, that the tradition of ancient politics up through, including for her, the liberals and Hobbes, is a tradition that emphasizes a kind of authority of the expert or the philosopher or the thinker over everybody else as a way of imposing order and in a sense eliminating freedom. When she talks about Greek freedom, as she's not talking about Plato and Aristotle, she's talking about the life of the polis as it's described by tragedians, by Herodotus, also by Socrates and Plato, and she sees this polis life as the life that both Plato and Aristotle and everyone after them comes to be afraid of and comes to worry about and try to control. So she's not developing this idea of freedom out of ancient philosophy. She's developing it out of ancient practice, and arguing that that the philosophy actually was suspicious of freedom, and as a result sought to elevate truth over politics. But politics, she thinks, was associated with freedom. On the liberals, right, the modern tradition of liberalism, I mean, liberalism is a philosophy of freedom, of liberty. It's an attempt to have the maximum amount of freedom with the minimal amount of order. And so one could think, oh, well, liberalism is a philosophy of freedom. But the freedom that liberals aim for is not political freedom. Political freedom is disorderly and dangerous. The freedom that liberals, whether it's Hobbes or Mill or Locke or Rousseau, aim for, is the freedom to live your life the way you want to in private. And so the whole premise of liberal political philosophy is that freedom is bracketed out of politics, and politics is supposed to be run by a sovereign, a leviathan, or a rational legislature, or a general will, or a utilitarian system, under Mill, that is going to make the decisions so that there are laws and orders, and so people can then know where they can pursue their free lives in private. And so that's the way she understands. I'm hearing can you guys mute yourself? Let me mute everybody. Can someone mute? Yana, can you mute everyone?
Yes, everyone is muted.
Get a
Sorry.
feedback.
Yeah.
And so that's how she understands both the ancients and the liberals. Does that help, Stephen? I hope.
Yes, yes, it does. I mean, I appreciate that. It intrigues me and flummoxes me both at the same time, but I think that's a tension inherent in her thought and part of what to explore further.
Good. Jeff.
Hello. Yeah, it's been 7 years since I read this essay. I think that's probably a little too long. but in the intervening time, I've become much more familiar with Kant, and so this was, so far it's been a much easier read. But of course, Kant's idea of freedom is tricky for a lot of people. So this very So this is mostly general comment, although I'm looking at the end of chapter 1 here, but it's just briefly when she refers to the philosopher's abstention from politics as a prerequisite for the highest and freest way of life, the vita contemplativa. The idea of freedom, our historical moment is that we're sort of renegotiating what the heck freedom means, right? It's one of those words. It definitely belongs in the noumena, right? And what I like about her, the way she does Kant here, is that it's much more empirical. That's not really quite the word there, but it's coming from the body. She describes the feeling of freedom, the feeling of acting in the world, and the emotions that often come along with that, like honor, and principle. I think kind of falls there too. That we're busy sort of renegotiating, as I said, what it means to be free. And so that particular passage I just alluded to, it's not very much, but that's just where this question came up for me, which is that I know you've written a lot about academic freedom, and I'm wondering how you would connect that. I haven't read most of that yet, but how would you connect that to this essay and her concept of freedom, in the abstract, so to speak, that it is here? That'd be a nice example to put feet on the ground in this discussion of freedom.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. So you threw me for a loop at the end there. I thought we were going to talk about Kant and Christian freedom, and now it's academic freedom. I mean, on the fly, I mean, academic. I think one of the things that I've done in my work on this is I've distinguished academic freedom from freedom of speech, right? Freedom of speech is something that exists in the political world, and I think the goal of freedom of speech is to give as wide a range of opinions as one can. It begins with the idea that none of us has a perspective that understands the whole world, and if our goal is to live amidst a plurality of people, we have to hear all the different voices. And so for her, freedom of speech and is a requirement of politics because it allows multiple perspectives into the political world. Academic freedom, I think, is similar, but an academic institution is not a political institution, right? Its aim is to um, uh, its aim is to pursue knowledge and teach people how to pursue knowledge. Now, we can also say that its job is to educate people into being a good citizen if we have a wider understanding of an academic institution. In any case, in both those cases, you have to be able to hear opposing viewpoints, right? Because you can be wrong, both in politics and in philosophy or in physics. The difference is that in the academic world, because our goal is not ultimately political plurality and thus freedom, but our goal is knowledge of some sort, we probably put more constraints on the way one can speak, right? In a classroom, you can't just sit there and yell and scream and interrupt people, which you can in certain public venues. There's a kind of order, you're supposed to speak in ways that respect each other and don't denigrate them for who they are or where they come from or whatever, but you engage the ideas, not in the person. And there may be times when people want to speak, but they simply don't know anything. And you should at least hear them long enough to know whether they should be heard. But at some points, and if you're going to keep a class going or keep a research seminar going, or a lecture going, sometimes you're going to have to say, you know what, we've heard your point, you've made your point, but this person is the person who's people are here to speak, people are here to hear, and we're going to listen to him. And so I think there are slightly different concerns with academic institutions than there are with pure politics. So, I think in any situation you have to look at that and ask, what's the purpose of the institution? For our end, the purpose of a political world is freedom. That's not the purpose of an academic institution, right? It's character development and knowledge, I think, would be the two that I would put up there. I mean, I think the problem we've had with protests and stuff on campuses in the last year, and you've seen it in the congressional hearings and other things, is that a number of the institutions and the presidents who led those institutions that ran into problems, the problem was that they started talking about free speech. And I think what that showed is that they've lost a sense of why they're doing what they're doing in an academic institution. They rely on what's become a cliche in the United States, free speech, which is a essential prerequisite for political life. But they've forgotten, or maybe never knew, what it means to run an academic institution. And that requires that they actually teach people things. And that if students or faculty or anyone is going around simply shouting propaganda or saying things that are wrong, part of a job of an academic institution is not to punish them, right? But to teach them and to figure out ways to engage them. And that's, to me, the mistake that a lot of these leaders, academic leaders, who unfortunately are caught up in bureaucracies with lawyers and worried about donors and all this stuff. And I think they've just forgotten the very essence of what it means to be an academic institution. So that's how I would say that. Thanks. I can't use my mouse, so I can't move around. John Holt.
Hi, Roger. I'd like to draw our attention to section 2 of the chapter on what is freedom. It kind of blew my mind because it seems to me that she has a really radical concept of freedom.
Yeah.
And this is what got to me. Let's see. All right. Action to be free must be free from motive on one side, from its intended goal as a predictable effect on the other. This is not to say that motives and aims are not important factors in every single act, but that they are its determining factors. That is, its limiting factors. And if they're limiting factors, then they're limiting freedom and therefore making them not free. All right. Let's see. And action is free to the extent that it is able to transcend them. That is, to be able to transcend motive and aim. Or
That's
purpose.
right. That's right.
That is so radical that it has to transcend your very motive, which is your internal discussion between me and myself in the act of judgment, and to proceed to an action. It has to be free from motive and the goal or the whole purpose of action. Now, on the one hand, it just seems to me that that is kind of a nihilism. And I know that that's an extreme word, but it's the focus on the exercise and the experience of freedom to the exclusion of anything else. On the other hand, it is another way of talking about her emphasis in other places about the importance of what she calls natality as opposed to mortality. That is, natality is the emergence into being of something completely new, a new person. And so that in itself is a value because it always leaves the future open.
Yeah.
All
So
right.
John, let me jump in because it's a good question and I want to make sure I get it right. If you don't mind, I think I've got the question and I want to, because what you said is very powerful. And yet I think in the end, you make one mistake, and I just want to make sure we get that out. You're absolutely right that it is a radical idea of freedom that says that freedom is not guided in any determinative way, right? Through either the intellect or motive, you know, or will, right?
Yeah.
All these, she says, have some role, right? But action, as you rightly pointed out, to be free must be free from motive on one side and from its intended goal as predictable effect on the other. You know, if I want to engage with this group, right, I could have all sorts of motives, right? I could want to be famous. I could want to be rich. I could want to waste my time. I could do a lot of things, right? I mean, all sorts of motives. And what she's saying is, yeah, those motives are there. You know, the soldier who goes and risks their lives at war may want to be famous. They may want to get away from their family. I mean, all sorts of motives, right? But what makes it free is not them. And the intended aim, right? You know, intended aim may be important. Maybe they believe in the war aim, or maybe they want to kill people, right? The point is, those aims may be there, but that's not what makes it free. Now you then say, well, this sounds like nihilism because there's nothing driving my freedom. My freedom is just natality, it's whatever I want, you know, something new. But that's exactly not what she's saying, right? And that's why she follows this paragraph, right, with this long inquiry into principle, right? she says in the next paragraph, action, insofar as it is free, is neither under the guidance of the intellect, right? It's not under the aims. It's not under my judgment of the war is good or the war is bad, or I want to educate people, in a reading group. That's not what makes what I'm doing free, right? It's not under the intellect, nor under the dictate of the will. It's not under my motives or my desire to implement these ideas. Although it needs both, right? I need both an intellectual aim and I need a will. But she says action, insofar as is free, springs from something altogether different, which I shall call a principle. Now, again, I've tried to say these principles are difficult to understand, but the whole point of a principle is it's not mere subjective thought, and thus this is not nihilism. The important thing to understand is that the principle for her is a impartial. It is a objective, not in the sense of objective truth, but it is something in the world. It is a worldly principle. She says principles do not operate from within the self as motives do, but inspire, as it were, from without. Principles are things that are shared collectively. Now, if I understand that correctly, right? What that means is that the inspiring principle that is shared is not something we know. It doesn't tell us what to do as an intellectual idea or as a will directing us, but it's something that we build insofar as we act in accordance with it. And when other people see us acting in accordance with it, it gets built further and it gets more manifest and it appears ever more fully. And it's that principle which she thinks is at the core of action, insofar as it's free, for which politics, that's the aim of politics, is to allow such principles to be acted upon and actualized and manifested in the world, such that the world forms a common political sense. Anyway, so I think it's I just want to be very clear. I mean, at least as I understand her, this is the farthest thing from nihilism you can get, because what it requires is the courage to act according to principle, even if you lose your life, right? You have to risk your life, your wealth, your safety. You have to put the world above yourself. That's not nihilism. That's an engagement with the world.
Okay, and I just want to follow by just saying, yes, and I agree with your assessment. And a principle would be a maxim of action that is recognized by others. It doesn't originate with the self. It is recognized by the self first, and then as it is articulated through action, it is recognized as having validity by others.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. That's why politics requires a public space in which you act in front of others, so that they can either say no or yes. They can clap or not. They can affirm what you're doing as in accordance with a principle that they all recognize as well, or they can reject it as a principle that they don't share. And politics is about the constant action, recognition, etc., in which we build together a political world. It's an imminent. Whereas for Kant, right, I must act according to the maxim, such that the maxim of my actions accords with universal law, right, from the top down. Here, the principles are built up.
Yep.
It's an imminent idea.
Very good. Thank you, Roger.
Having trouble today. I just am aware that so far all the questions have come from men. Nothing against us, but if there are non-men who do want to ask questions, I'd encourage you to raise your hand. Next in the queue is George.
Thank you. I agree with you, Roger, and with the previous speaker, except in one thing. I don't think this is anything really new. And the way I think I understood this whole thing is through an ecological example of which is a splitting beehive. And it's not new because I think Aristotle called the bees a political animal. And that time they were arguing, I think, about whether a beehive is a monarchy or an authoritarian thing or a democracy. And I think that current biologists go toward the democracy aspect of it. And the way that the freedom works is there's a certain number of foraging bees, of let's say conscious pariah bees, who are brave enough to go out and forage and look for a new space for the part of the beehive, which is obviously a political decision. And then they come back, and then they do a woggle dance, which means that they get they argue among each other until they do enough of a dance to convince enough of the other bees, the citizen bees, to split off. And the queen doesn't have any part in that decision. And I think that this is the same, as you were saying. Yes, there are no personal aims or motives, but there's a collective aim or motive, which we call a principle. I mean, whatever you want to call it. And there it comes not to group collection, but to swarm intelligence. And that's a whole different new type of aspect. But I think an example of a beehive is a very nice example of what Arendt is talking about.
Thank you, George. I'm going to leave that as a comment since I don't know enough about it to comment, but I appreciate it. I'm going to have time for last two questions from Larry and Joanne. I'll take these questions together and then I'll try and answer them.
So how does misinformation and AI and social media come into what we have now? This book was written quite before all of that, fit into the tenets of freedom.
Okay, thank you. Joanne?
As I read this essay, I started thinking about Habermas and the notion of the public sphere and the shrinking of the public sphere. And I was wondering if you had any ideas about how that might affect what she is saying here, and whether the public sphere is in fact a political or something a little bit different.
Thank you. You know, Larry's question about I'm not sure. I mean, to one extent, you can say that we've created a public sphere in which people feel empowered to say whatever they want, right? My crowd is bigger than your crowd. I won, I lost. You know, whatever it is, right? And there's a sense in which we used to try and control the public discourse through gatekeepers, right? I mean, I'm not being any, this is stuff that's well trodden. Whether they were newspaper editors or, you know, or TV hosts, right? The people who had a platform were people who, you know, had a certain amount of established credit. The public sphere was thus a little bit more like an academic realm, right? Where there were standards and who was allowed to speak, etc. That's a problem in the public sphere, and it comes from this long history of suspicion of politics and a suspicion of freedom and the desire to control politics and control freedom that Arendt tells in her story. And part of what's happened is that social media and AI and other things have liberated the public sphere from those gatekeepers. But from an Arendtian point of view, there's something good about that, right? To bring more freedom into the public sphere. And yet, the action has to be, courageous. Well, anonymous posts are not courageous.
Exactly.
And so if you really want to, one of the things that I think would be absolutely essential if you wanted to try and harness the, social media and such for a kind of courageous and free politics would be to either require or demand or encourage, however you're going to do it, that people put their name on everything they do, and they do it with courage rather than with spite and impunity. That's just one element of it. But
Well,
yes,
to interrupt you, I think that there's a lack of that action involved with the forces that are attempting to be marshaled using social media. There's anybody can say anything. There's that freedom, but to gain consensus and seems to be many of these arguments on social media lacking. So
Yeah.
there's a lack of action, and I think that
Well-
would be something that Arendt would have would certainly have something to say about.
yeah, no, I mean, she would not think much of social media as action.
Right.
I'm just saying, you could imagine social media becoming, more of a public sphere, but I don't think it is, as long as people are shouting at it anonymously, and as long as people are ganging up on people and attacking them for who they are and taking their posts out of context and using deep fakes and all sorts of stuff. On the question of the public sphere and Habermas, I mean, Arendt also thought the public sphere was shrinking, right? She thought it's being replaced by the social. I mean, Habermas and Arendt see this quite differently. I mean, Habermas has this hope that the public sphere could be harnessed in a kind of technical way under a kind of, what he calls a speech situation in which we lead to the truth through kind of, different technical manners. I mean, Arendt just doesn't believe in political truth. I mean, they're just fundamentally opposed on that. And so, they're both worried about the shrinking of the public sphere, but for very different reasons. I just will leave it at that for now because I'm out of time. I look forward to finishing this essay with you next week, and we'll talk about the whole essay next week, but focus on sections 3 and 4. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and I'll see you next week. Thanks very much.